Okay, so we started this study. Well, in a sense, we started it 3 weeks ago, but last week we kind of got focused on Zipporah herself, particularly, and this week we'll finish off that study. Yeah, these mysteries have been a problem in Christianity and in Judaism for a long, long time, and there are two things that are said here that don't make any sense until you can put all of the pieces together. And so these two mysteries, one of them comes from Numbers 12:1, and we'll talk about this one particular a little bit more later on in detail. But what's happened here is Moses' brother and sister have got on his case about marrying a Cushite woman, and so the verse in there says that they're angry with him because he is still married to this Cushite woman. And then the verse immediately after that says, "For he had married a Cushite woman," which is a complete duplication of what was just said. And it's kind of strange, and it's notable for its strangeness because the Bible doesn't do that sort of thing hardly ever. And so we saw that duplication in there. And then the other mystery, which is kind of similar in a sense, comes in Exodus 4, and this is when Moses and his family, including Zipporah, are heading down to Egypt to begin the Egypt part of his life. And what she says there is she talks about a bridegroom of blood, and people have had no understanding practically of what she means by that bridegroom of blood thing. And so that's the second mystery, is what does Zipporah mean when she says this? And so we have these two mysteries, and the second one is like the first one in that right after that there's another duplication, and it says, for she had said bridegroom of blood. And that duplication is strange there again. But the duplication is actually telling us something. God just doesn't do things for no reason. He has purpose behind things that he does. And so we see two things in those duplications. They're both talking about a person and a woman, in fact, a Cushite woman, and talking about Zipporah in the other one. So they have that in common. And they also have in common marriage. And so in the Numbers version, which is when they're in the wilderness, this is all of the Israelites in the wilderness. So they say that Moses had married this Cushite woman. So they talk about marriage there, but in the tense of it had happened before. And now in the Exodus passage, which comes earlier, it talks about Moses being a bridegroom. And so they have in common the idea of marriage of Moses, and in common the idea of this woman. And from that, we can take a couple things and understand that these two verses are linked together. And I hope you can understand that how they're linked here, because they both talk about a woman and they both talk about a marriage. And so what we learn from that, we understand from that, is that Zipporah is indeed the Cushite wife that is mentioned in Numbers 12, because that was never clear in Numbers 12. It was always just the Cushite wife, and Zipporah wasn't mentioned. And the other thing that we can understand from that is that they become married at the time of the circumcision, which seems kind of odd to us because they already have two children. And we understood that last week and understood how that came to be. And the reason for that is that Zipporah was a slave. In fact, she's a Gentile slave. She's an Ethiopian, or a Cushite, as they called them back then. So she's a slave wife, and that's the proper term to use there. Although normally she would just be called a wife, because slavery didn't make that much difference, although it made some differences in certain areas. And so we saw that Zipporah was given to Moses as a slave wife, not as a married wife. And we talked about what the difference was between slave wife and married wife, but I won't go into that anymore here. And we saw that she was pregnant when she was given to Moses. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. And we also saw that Moses names the son after their shared reality. He and the son have something in common. And this tells us a little bit about Moses, and it tells us a little bit about how he views this new son. And he considers both of himself as to be wandering far from home. So at this point in his life, remember that he hasn't had the whole burning bush experience, none of that. God hasn't called him yet. So all he has is he looks back and he says, once upon a time, I was a prince in Egypt, and I lived in wealth and glory and all sorts of things. And now here I am in the middle of the wilderness, not living so easily. So he sees himself as wandering far from home, but he also sees this son as wandering far from home too, because he is a Cushite a long ways from where the land of Cush was. And so this shared reality is what he uses as the basis for naming his son as he does. And what we also saw last week is that the boy is not circumcised. And so that kind of gives us another hint that the boy is not Moses' son, and Moses really doesn't see the boy as being his son because he hasn't circumcised him. Okay, so that's what we covered last week. So we'll start by asking the question here that is maybe most interesting is Zipporah is pregnant when she's given to Moses. We can see that by looking carefully at the verses. And why was that? How would that be? And the Bible doesn't really say. We can figure out from some other numbers that Zipporah was probably in her mid 50s at this time, and Moses is in his late 70s at the time the child is born. And so there's a bit of an age difference there, but not a critical age difference. And that might seem old to us because people don't live as long, but people were still living longer than we do because the flood had been closer to their time. So for Moses, we saw that he lived 120 years. Miriam lived 126. Aaron lived 123. So it wasn't uncommon for people to live quite a bit longer, and therefore their years for giving birth were longer than ours as well. So, so the most likely thing that results in her being given to Moses while she is pregnant is that her previous husband has died. And there are different ways that he could have died. It might have been through a disease or an injury, because those were much more life-threatening back then. A small injury that we would easily go off to have some surgery done and fixed could be the end of a life matter at those times. And in diseases, we know that that's true from the New Testament. There's a couple stories there of people who died of diseases, and they had no way of dealing with most diseases back then. So it might have been a disease or an injury, but it could have been some other things too. It might have just been that he'd been involved in a battle. There might have been a war or something, and he'd gone off to fight in that war and he died there. So there's other possibilities too, but the most likely ones that you would see in this circumstance were diseases or injuries of some sort. So he would have died while she was pregnant, and so she was given to Moses to take care of, probably knowing that she was pregnant. And so she was probably showing at that time, and they knew this. And so she was given to Moses as an act of mercy that was shown to her. She had lost her husband. She was pregnant. She really needed a husband and a family. So she was given to Moses, and Moses accepts her in that same way. He is showing a grace to her in accepting her, a pregnant woman, to be his wife, even though as a slave wife. So we can see some things there that are quite interesting that explain why she was pregnant at that time. That might have seemed a bit odd. So, and we'll get to also one of the big questions here is, was Moses born without a foreskin? And there's still debate in Jewish circles about this. Not everyone agrees, because you have to kind of look carefully at the text and think about it, and not everyone thinks the same way. But it's actually not that uncommon to do, even in our day and age. Some boys are born with too much foreskin, and they have to be surgically changed. Otherwise, that's going to interfere with their function. And there are others who are born with none. And I read some about this in medical journals, and I also saw a Jewish site where they were talking about this. And there were a couple of boys there who said, yes, they were born without a foreskin. And so when it actually came time when they got to the age where they would have a bris, which is a coming of age ceremony, the rabbi who was in charge of that wanted to make sure that they had been circumcised. And the boy said, well, I wasn't actually circumcised. I was born without a foreskin. And the rabbi had to go back to his birth records to make sure that was true. And because it was true, it was allowed for him to have the bris ceremony. So this is something that does happen in our age too. It's not a common thing. It's certainly not talked about much. In fact, that's a word that I've hardly ever used except outside of this study. So his mother describes him in an odd way, describes Moses in an odd way when he's born. And so here's the verse from Exodus 2:2 that talks about that. And the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Now, that word beautiful is translated in a bunch of different ways in different translations. In the NIV and some others, it says fine child. In the NLT and some others, it says special baby. KJV and a couple others say goodly child. When you look at Strong's Concordance to see what the meaning of the word is, it also includes words like excellent or perfect. And I kind of like those words better here. But you can see with the goodly child, especially in the special baby, that this isn't just because he's beautiful. There's something more to him than that. And so the people who look at that would say, well, any mother who gives birth to a child is going to say the child is beautiful. What mother says, oh, what an ugly child they just gave birth to? No mother says that. And so it's not just that he's good looking as a child. There's something more to that. And so a lot of Jewish sages and other people agree that this is one of the indications that he was born in a perfect state. He didn't have a foreskin, and so there was no need to make any changes to him. He was perfect and needed no changes. And so he was born in an born circumcised in a sense. He had no foreskin. So, we know that he would have been circumcised if it could have been possible to do that, because he is it's 3 months before he's put out in his little boat to go out on the Nile and be picked up, and so he's way past the age when he would have been circumcised if that was possible for him to be. And so that's one of the indications, is what his mother says about him when he's born. Another indication comes from Pharaoh's daughter. And she says, as soon as she picks him up out of the Nile and looks at him, she says, oh, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Well, how does she know that? Well, it's not skin color. She doesn't know from skin color. She knows because it's a circumcised boy. He has no foreskin. And so she says, okay, he must be one of the Hebrews' children, because that's what they do. So she is saying that he's circumcised, and but his mother seems to be saying that there's something different about him, and he's special than and different from other children. So to Pharaoh's daughter, he looks circumcised, but in fact he never had circumcision, is the idea. And the third part of that is the passage we'll come to a little bit later on here, and that's where Zipporah does that circumcision. And that whole episode of the circumcision just doesn't make any sense if Moses hasn't been circumcised and could be circumcised. And we'll go into that some more later on in detail. But so from those three different places, what his mother says, what Pharaoh's daughter says, and from this circumcision passage, there really isn't another explanation that can explain what goes on there, except the fact that Moses was born without a foreskin. Okay, now there's also something to be said about the boys. We're told of the birth of the first boy right away, but later another son is born, and there is absolutely no mention of his birth or his name or anything. None of that comes until way back or way on in the wilderness time. And there isn't really even an indication that there's a second son until the family heads off to go down to Egypt. And the indication that you see there is simply that it says Moses puts his sons, plural, on a donkey along with Zipporah, and they head off to Egypt. And that's the first time you hear that there's more than one son. And so later the Bible refers to Zipporah's son. So at this time we know that in fact there are two boys, but it only talks about Zipporah having a son. And as though we would know which one of those two sons that's being referred to here. And so that kind of indicates that there's a difference between one of the sons and the other son. One of them is kind of considered Zipporah's son, and the other one is their son. So this all seems to be another indication that Zipporah was pregnant with a child who was not Moses' child when she became a slave wife to him. Okay, so now we're ready to actually get to the circumcision incident here. And so these are the verses from Exodus 4 that talk specifically about what happens there. It says, now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met them and sought to put him to death, him as Moses. Then Zipporah took a flint, like a flint knife, and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me. So God, let him alone, let Moses alone. Okay, so there's a number of things that we need to point out here. One was that flint knife, and if you don't know what a flint knife is, it's a knife made out of a very sharp rock. And so NASB, though, uses the word threw here as though she took that foreskin that she cut off and threw it at his feet. But when you look at the Hebrew, what it actually says there is the word is touched. And translators are using different words there, but touched really has more meaning, and it shows us that this isn't about circumcising the son. This is something about Moses, that he needs to be touched with this blood, and that fixes a problem that he has. And so touched indicates that there was a circumcision problem with Moses. And so we can just by doing a little bit of thought here, we can say, well, if Moses had been circumcised here, there wouldn't have been a problem. So if it was possible for him to be circumcised at this time, and God was angry with him because he wasn't circumcised, that he could have done that. That wouldn't have been a problem. But if Moses had a foreskin, but had never been circumcised, all he had to do was just cut that off, and it's done and gone. And so the only answer here is that Moses lacked a circumcision because circumcision wasn't possible for him. So that goes back to what I was saying on the earlier slide, is that this is one of those indications that Moses hadn't been circumcised because he couldn't be circumcised. And so this is the alternative method of doing that. And in the lesson 2 weeks ago, we talked about one parent or one person of the family being able to cover for another person of the family. And we'll come back to that idea later on here. Okay, continuing on with this. So it seems like the story here is that God has been tolerating Moses in this uncircumcised state. And that's because there was just nothing that could be done about it. Moses was born without the foreskin and he couldn't be circumcised. And so you just couldn't do anything there. And even in Leviticus, it isn't clear what you would do in a state like that. But what we see happening just before this discussion of the circumcision incident, just a few verses before, is we see that God has just given Moses signs to perform, and the Bible says these signs are going to be done in Moses' power. So Moses has been given the power to do these signs. And you remember what the signs were, the snake and the other things, water to blood in the Nile. Those sorts of signs are what Moses is going to be taking with him. And so God has given Moses the ability to perform these signs. And so this is a new power. And combined with that uncircumcised state that Moses is in, this is no longer tolerable to God. He has to get a resolution to this. And what we also see here is that Zipporah shows an amazing level of understanding about circumcision. As I said earlier, you couldn't look at Leviticus or any of the law and see that a son could be circumcised and his blood could be applied to his father and fix his lack of circumcision. And so somehow she understands this. We know that she lives in a household that practices circumcision, but this is an A-level understanding of circumcision, and somehow she has this, and she realizes that the circumcision blood for the son can be sprinkled on the father and heal him from his lack of circumcision and purify him. So, and as I said, the law of Moses, which comes later on, didn't make this clear either. And so this purification is very much in line with the lesson that we talked about 2 weeks ago, which talked about the mother's purification after birth, in that she purifies her daughter by having a longer period of purification. But this is kind of the reverse and done for men inside. So this is the son purifying the father. And so it isn't a crazy idea in that way, because we saw the mother purifying the newborn daughter in a different way, but still purification. And that's the goal here. And so what's happening here with this circumcision is that Moses is being purified from his birth, which it wasn't possible before. Now, here's the neat thing, is that Zipporah also sees the opportunity here for her. As a slave, Moses could have sold her or her children at any time. That was just kind of the right of a slave. And that's not a situation that any mother would want. Now, that doesn't mean Moses would have, but it was possible. She had no real security. And so, as any mother would, she'd rather settle down and make a home for her sons and her husband and have a life like that. But that's for a slave, you don't have that solidity in your life, and that's a difficult thing to do. But she knows the solution for Moses. She's understood that this son's blood can do this, but she sees the catch here. The boy must be the son by blood of Moses. And right now, he isn't a son by blood. And so what has to happen here is that Moses is going to have to accept her as a married wife and not just a slave wife. And so it makes sense now of what she says with this bridegroom of blood stuff. She touches the circumcision to his feet and says, and I'm paraphrasing here, for that blood to count, he must be your son, and therefore we are married by that blood. And so bridegroom of blood is what she's saying, or that's what she means with bridegroom of blood. And so what she does here is that she purifies Moses, yes, with that circumcision blood from her son, but she also gets an upgrade from a slave wife to a blood wife, and her boys are also free from their slavery too. So it's really kind of neat that way. She gets to move up because of this. Okay, so another question here is the idea of seeking to put Moses to death. Was God really seeking to kill Moses? Was that his desire? The text says that God was seeking to kill him. And we don't understand these things because we don't understand God well enough. We don't understand what it is to know the future like God does. We don't know the future in the way that He has. So you, we would, we have trouble understanding this, and so I want to try and make that clear here. Yes, God was upset enough with this situation to kill Moses, and so Moses is uncircumcised, and God sees it, and God has just given him the ability to do these miracles in front of God's people, and he doesn't want this unpurified man doing these miracles. And so God is very upset with this situation. But notice what happens here. God doesn't vent that anger, even though there's only a few verses between the burning bush when God empowers Moses that way and when they're headed down to Egypt. There's actually a period of time there. And so during this period of time, God is putting together all of the pieces that are needed to fix this problem. And so God doesn't vent that anger until it might have even been a year later that they actually headed down to Egypt, certainly a fair time later. And that's when God comes in and it's seeking to put Moses to death. And so what God has done here is he's set up Zipporah and the uncircumcised boy. He's got all those places together. All these three people are together in a place where they can deal with this. And God also knows that Zipporah has this understanding of the fact that the boy can circumcise the father, and he knows that all the pieces are in place to resolve this problem. And he also knows that she wanted to be a wife. She didn't want to be a slave wife. Nobody wants to be a slave wife. And he knows that Moses is going to need a wife to take care of him, and a dedicated wife like that. So God knows all of these things. He's put all of these puzzle pieces together, and he knows that if he just lets Moses know how upset he is about this situation, then the situation can be resolved because all of the pieces are there to resolve it. And so Moses was never in any danger. God was really just angry with him to motivate the change that was going to happen, that needed to happen. So as we people who don't see into the future would view it, as we see God as applying a little pressure. He brought all of the pieces together. He had the son that was uncircumcised, and Zipporah who had the understanding, and all of these things were all together in one place. He just needed that little bit of pressure, that little spark to make it all happen and come together. And so that's what he does. He applies that pressure as we see things. Okay, the Ethiopian wife problem. This is we talked about it before. The time when the brother and sister of Moses are getting on Moses' case because he's married to a Cushite woman. And so I'll read this verse. It says, Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. That's that duplication I mentioned earlier, a pointless duplication seemingly, but it isn't pointless because it ties together that idea of marriage and the Cushite woman. And that ties us back to Exodus 2, as we saw. So that's the verse. Moses and Aaron, the brother and sister of Moses, or Miriam and Aaron, the brother and sister of Moses, are on his case because he's married to a Cushite woman. And the law of Moses has just come out, and the law of Moses says God's people are not to marry Gentiles. He's married to a Gentile. They think that he's doing wrong by continuing this marriage. And what's really going on is not that. But the real problem here, as we see in that story, but not necessarily in these verses, is that Miriam and Aaron are looking to move up in the chain of command. They want to elevate themselves to be as high as Moses or maybe even over Moses. And so they're trying to find a reason to say he's doing wrong and we're better than he is. And so they think that Moses should have gotten rid of Zipporah, but he hasn't. And that's what they're using to try to make themselves look better. So this is really a political move. It's really not about the law at all. And they're just using the law to try and move things in their favor. But Moses can't annul the marriage. If you think about it for just a little bit, even if he wanted to, he couldn't do that because if he annulled it, an annulled marriage means that the marriage was a mistake from the start. It was never valid. It should never have happened. And it just didn't exist is effectively what you're saying. But if he does that, then he annuls his circumcision, and that's not going to be a workable situation at all. And so he can't annul the marriage, even if that's what he wanted to do. And so God sees them squabbling about this, and he jumps in on this and slaps down Miriam and Aaron. Because he knows that this is a political move. This really has nothing to do with the application of the law. This is really about them trying to move up. And he explains that Moses is in a special place over them, and that's the way it's going to be. Okay, so summarizing all of what we've covered here, This story of Zipporah is really a wonderful story. And it's a story about many things. It's about God preparing a man for ministry and all the things that he does that to arrange that. He puts Zipporah into his life, and she has this understanding, and he puts an unborn or not an uncircumcised son in there who's going to be able to fix the problem. And so it's largely a hidden story. You have to really dig into it to find out all of the details to it. And much like the problem is hidden as a hidden problem, it's a hidden story. And so we see how God can see things differently than we do. And that's been part of this. He sees impurities and things like that we don't see, we don't understand. And in this case, he sees specifically that Moses has this impurity, and this impurity has been part of Moses since he was born. And so Moses may not even be aware of it at that time. And certainly, even if he was aware of it, he has no idea how to resolve this problem. Doesn't There's no fix ever written down about this. So, but this impurity can't go on with God. God wants to be very close to Moses, and he talks to the brother and sister of Moses about that. He says, with Moses, I speak to him face to face. With you through dreams and visions, but with him, I speak to him face to face. And so that relationship that God wants to have with Moses can't exist if that impurity still exists. And so the impurity had to be dealt with. And so what God did was he knew how to deal with it. He knew that there was a solution, and he brought all the pieces together to make that happen. And so we also see in here that there are rare cases where there have to be exceptions to the law. The law is a general thing for the most common situations, but as any law is, there are often special cases that have to be dealt with in special ways, and that's what happened here. Any questions on that?
Question.
Yeah.
Or a comment anyway. When he says that Moses and God spoke face to face, it really can't be literal, I would think, because the Bible is clear that no man has ever seen God and lived, you know?
Yeah.
So if you're going to take that literally, then you have to deal with that verse.
Yeah.
So then you've got to back up a little bit and think, wait a minute, what does it mean? Maybe more personally, or more spiritually, or more, I don't know, but it just can't be quite literal. I don't know what you think about that.
No, you're absolutely right. It isn't literal. It's an idiom, and we have a similar idiom. We kind of say, in fact, face to face is not what the Bible says. The exact translation is mouth to mouth. But we have an idiom that is similar to that, which is used in this place, which is face to face, which means you have a direct talking relationship. It's not over email or mail or something like that. You have a direct relationship for talking and communicating. And yeah, like you said, it doesn't mean that Moses can see him face to face. It means that they have a communication relationship like that. And so God speaks to Moses all of the time, filling in Moses on all the details that Moses is going to need to know. And in details that his brother and sister don't get.
Yeah, because there was a time that Moses asked him to show him his glory, and he didn't really comply with that. He just went behind him, and still affected him, you know, where he was all shiny and all of that, and his face was lit up and everything. So that's why a lot of people, you know, take that literally, but I think it just can't be, you know.
Yeah, it's not literal.
Yeah, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because there's other verses in the Bible that people are so sure it means one thing, but then there's something in the Bible, other verses in the Bible that say something completely different. Like, for example, as you and I have discussed many times, people are always saying that when you die, you're going to go to heaven. And so they take that verse that says that your reward is in heaven, you know. Well, yeah, if you take that literally, it sounds like you are going to go to heaven. But then the Bible says that heaven is God's throne, and it doesn't really. And in fact, it even goes on to say that the Lord will that we will rule the earth, you know, and so forth. You know, so without going too much into that, that's just an example of how things get thrown off. So we need to be more careful about those things.
Yeah, we need to always be careful about that. And one way to know that that's an idiom is that it does appear in other places. in the Bible. And so it's an expression like we might say, what's a good idiom that we use? Keep it under your hat is a good one. And so that doesn't mean literally wearing a hat. It means keep this information to yourself. And so it's an idiomatic expression like that. It doesn't mean that God was face to face with Moses. Moses couldn't have survived that.